Hello valued viewers, I hope you're all doing very well. Today we're in the F-15E and we're looking at the terrain following radar. The first thing to say is that it is not driven by the main aircraft radar. It's actually driven by the separate radar in the nav pod here. So you will need to have the AN/AAQ-13 attached. Setting up an example in the mission editor. Assuming that you want to start terrain following straight away, ensure that your aircraft is starting between 400 and 650 knots ground speed. Also set your starting altitude above ground, the same or higher than the altitude you intend to fly at, certainly not below. And then your steer points or waypoints. If you're anything like me, you want to make it as hard as possible straight away. So you would set something like this up down this valley with steer points set really low altitude, carving through the valley with visions of Top Gun canyon runs. Well, that's just not realistic. The terrain following radar on the F-15E has many limits, especially in terms of roll and turn. So the idea of having the F-15E Top Gun style 50 feet from the surface meandering through this valley won't really work. We'll explain why a little bit later. So we'll start with something a bit less ambitious. This one's a bit better. Steer point, steer point, steer point over about 30 or 40 miles. Okay, welcome into the cockpit. We'll have most of this on active pause, so the systems work, but I'm not actually moving, so I can explain it. So first, most important thing, to get access to all symbologies and functions, master mode to nav or instrument. Symbologies we'll be interested in today will be in any of the screens, coloured or monochrome, and in the HUD. Let's set the screens up. I'm going to use terrain following on this left screen, and I'm going to use HSI, we'll need for autopilot on the right screen. Basic switchology. Let's make sure that terrain following radar is set from its default standby to on. Ensure that radar altimeter is in the on position. Our actual main aircraft radar is irrelevant, doesn't matter. Also the nav FLIR, the IR part of the nav pod, doesn't need to be on, but it probably is anyway. There's one more switch that's quite important and really difficult to get to. Let me try and just show you down here on the left. This here, this guarded switch, is the fly-up arming switch. As standard, it's in the down position, meaning it's armed, which is good. That's where you want it. It means that automatic fly-ups are enabled, but I'm just making you aware that that switch is there in case you want to disable those fly-ups. Next, let's just position ourselves optimally for this description. So I'm going to fly and pause there. Right, so you know that we are traveling in that direction there towards our velocity vector. Our aircraft is actually pointing towards that symbol there. Here is our artificial horizon, where the Earth's horizon is. We are at a radar altitude of just above 1,000 feet. Note how we're traveling directly towards the center of the dam, or near enough. Next, let's focus on our terrain following screen. First, basic symbologies. It's an E-scope, which means it's a side view. We are positioned there, and we're pointing that way. 0 miles up to 10 nautical miles ahead of us. This line here, the kind of cascading dots where I'm following, is called the synthetic video. I like to call it the synthetic terrain line. It represents where the system thinks the terrain is ahead of us in terms of distance away and in terms of elevation. It has a backup, which is this kind of fuzzy line below it. That is the raw video. That's the actual radar returns from the nav pod. So in that case, why do we show both synthetic and the actual radar returns? It's a sanity and a safety check. Everything here is life and death. So we want to show where the system thinks the terrain is and where the actual terrain is. If they match like they do now, it's fine. If they vary apart from each other, there's a serious problem with the system. You need to abort mission. Next, very important, our velocity vector line, side view of it. Remember, it's where we're traveling, and it's that line there. Note how it's pointing if we zoom in to that little step there, and that's because that little step there is the dam. It's not perfectly vertical, and that's because dams aren't perfectly vertical. And that's why I showed where we're pointing, directly towards the center of that dam. So we're not pointing, but traveling. Next, at the top, we can set our desired clearance altitude, the height above terrain that we want to fly, 200, 300, 400, 500, or 1,000 feet. That will vary with various sub-options that we'll look at later, but let's stick at 500 feet. Next is the zero command line. It's this one here. It is a line that helps ensure that we are flying at the correct altitude as set at the top. Currently, it's resting a few hundred feet above the synthetic and raw terrain, as you can see here. It just means that we're flying too high, and we can confirm that by looking at our HUD. Yep, we're flying well over 1,000 feet above the ground. If the zero command line is below one of the terrain lines, then it means that we're flying too low. If it's resting on it perfectly, which we'll try and attain, that means we're flying at the correct altitude as desired. Next, this line here, our obstacle warning line. If it's out on the left and in no way interacting with the two terrain lines here and here, then everything's fine. If these terrain symbologies merge, touch, or pass the obstacle warning line at any point, then there's a critical chance the aircraft could crash, and then actions will happen, and we'll look at that later. Next, we've got some flight symbology. So repeated from the HUD, we have our horizon line here. We have our velocity vector here in relation to it. We also have this vertical line. That's our steering bar. That is guiding us in terms of left and right azimuth to our next selected steer point. And finally, in this section, we have our manual pitch command box here. What that's telling us by being lower than our velocity vector is that to get to our selected 500 feet above the terrain, we need to fly lower. If the box was up here above, then we need to fly higher. If the box was perfectly on the velocity vector circle here, we are flying at the correct altitude. Next, very important, we have our radar altitude here, 1,120 feet above ground, and our calculated ground speed of 425 knots. Remember, that needs to be above 400, less than 650. Next, MEA, our minimum established altitude, or as I like to call it, our safety altitude. Related to steer points, it is a value that's set that is a known safe altitude. So at this steer point, we know we can fly at 15,000 feet. There's no mountains, there's no terrain to worry about in this area. It comes into play with automation, with fly-ups. They'll automatically go up to this altitude, and we can change it. If we go to our front panel here, click on our steer point, we can see that we've got a MEA here of 15,000, and I can change that on the scratch pad there to be 12,000. Next is our raw video antenna position. I don't know why it's called video, by the way, because it's actually radar based, but anyway, it is. The raw video, this here, the big fuzzy one, is not necessarily directly in front of us. The nav pod can also look left and it can look right. It does that because as the aircraft rolls and goes around corners, it needs to adjust left and right to kind of look ahead of the turn, and this is just symbology showing that currently it's looking straight ahead, but it could look left and it could look right. It's again another safety factor to make sure that the system is working. If you roll left and this does not go left, then there's a problem. Abort mission. Next is our frequency. This is a radar, and if you have radars operating on separate planes on the same frequencies, then they will conflict and go weird, as you know from the air-to-air radar on this aircraft. So we have 8 presets that we can do. So if you're on a flight of 4 aircraft, make sure that you deconflict your frequencies. In the manual it says it's not modeled, but it probably will be soon, so bear that in mind. Next is our ride selection. I like to call it our comfort setting. Do we want a soft ride or do we want a hard ride? That controls, if you're in manual mode, the symbology, or if you're in automatic mode, the actual flight of the aircraft, how hard we want the pitch maneuvers to be. Both have +2 in positive G, and that's because positive G is quite easy to take. Negative G, if you've ever flown in an aircraft that can do more than -1, is incredibly uncomfortable. Soft will give you up to about half a negative G, and hard will give you 0.9 or about 1 negative G. Next are 6 sub-modes. It can be in normal, ECCM, WX1, WX2, LPI, and VLC. Let's go over the basics and then we'll look at the details. EECM, electronic countermeasures, similar to normal but will allow full automatic electronic countermeasures. The WXs are for rain, WX1 light rain, WX2 heavy rain. LPI, low probability of intercept. It makes our radar emit less so that it's harder to detect. And VLC will be for very soft terrain, not like we've got ahead of us now, and or water. If we look at it in a bit more detail, we'll see that each of these selections has different limits. Look at the scan. That is how the radar is going to be operating and scanning the terrain ahead. It makes a difference. Look at the turn rate limit. How many degrees per second can each of these modes sustain? That goes back to why I said that we couldn't do this running through a canyon, turning huge turns. It has to be within the limits. Clearance, each of these will give different clearance allowances. Also note that VLC, if I click here, will allow down to 100 because it's for very soft or low undulating terrain. For today, we will keep it in normal, and also if we look on our front panel here, we go back to our menu, it will tell us here which mode we're in, normal, EECM, and so on. Next, symbologies in the HUD. It has a lot of the same symbologies, but also some extra symbologies. So on the right here, we have, as you know, our radar altimeter. We're currently just over 1,000 feet. That there is showing the caret for our currently selected clearance, 500 feet. This is our manual pitch command, as we saw before. We have our roll indicator down here. We're currently rolling there, so slightly left. Added now our limits for left and right roll. We have a caret there for our roll and a caret there. Look how that one is actually further than that one, and that's simply because the nav pod is offset to one side. It can roll further one way than it can the other. Terrain following radar is all about sticking within the limit, so that is a good example of making sure that this triangle here does not go past the left or right roll limit caret. Also note this vertical bar is our steering bar again, taking us to our currently selected steer point. Also note that there will be additional text that come on the screen in terms of limits, warnings and cautions. They will show here, they will show here, they can also show left, they can also show right, and some of them will also show on the radar screen. Which takes us to our next section. At this point I would like to unpause and go and fly a nice manual flight for you, but no, we need to learn the limits, warnings and cautions of the system. So first, limits. We must fly within the limits. They give us a tiny bit of leeway, but we must correct that pretty quickly. First, bank angle must not exceed 60 degrees. It gives us 2 seconds to correct it before it basically takes over. Turn rate limit of 5.5 degrees in most modes. Again, we've got 2 seconds to correct it before it takes over. Turn acceleration of up to 2.2 degrees per second. You get 2 seconds again to correct that before it takes over. And finally, dive angle of more than 15 degrees. You get 3 seconds to correct that. Next, warnings, which will display above the velocity vector on the HUD, could be fly up, displayed as soon as the fly up is initiated. We'll talk about fly ups in a minute. The purpose is to alert the crew and to take control of the aircraft and recover from the fly up maneuver. Unarmed, displayed when the fly-up arm is requested but not available. We'll talk about that when we talk about the paddle switch. No ATF, displayed when the terrain following couple switch, that's the automatic mode, is in couple, but the ATF is disabled, usually because the aircraft is outside the ATF limits and the system cannot re-engage. TF fail, displayed when part of the terrain system fails, accompanied by light and voice warning. Obstacle or G limit, when radar detects an obstacle that will require a 2G or more pull up to clear. And finally, TF low, when the aircraft is approaching or descends below 75% of the selected terrain clearance, which is currently 500 feet. The low alt warning lights will turn on. And now the cautions, which will show on the HUD below the velocity vector. I'm not going to read through all of them, but you can snapshot and read that if you want, and they will show as soon as you go outside some kind of limit. Next is fly-ups. If you are operating with terrain following radar system on and you exceed one of the limits and you haven't corrected it even though you've been warned, then the system will take over and try and save you from a disaster. It may take command if your altitude is less than 75% of the set clearance, if you exceed the G limit, if you have an obstacle warning, if you're flying outside one of the myriad of terrain following limits, dive, bank, turn rate, turn acceleration, or if there's a system failure. When a fly-up happens, the system will automatically pull the aircraft up into safety, which leads us finally onto paddle. We are getting there, viewers. Paddle is this switch here. There are 3 real uses of paddle. It's a push and hold affair. So you push it, you do the thing, and then you release it. If the aircraft is doing a fly-up, an automatic fly-up, and you don't want it to, then you can actually override it by pushing and holding paddle, and then it will cancel the fly-up for as long as you are pushing and holding the paddle. Also, in terms of general use in the terrain following system, either using manual or automatic mode, you can temporarily disarm the terrain following system by pushing and holding paddle. This may happen if you're coming up to a tight corner where you know, for instance, that the terrain following system is going to struggle with that corner. Then you may want to disarm it just to get around that corner. Then when you're set on your way to the next steer point, release the paddle and the system rearms. And finally, resets. There will be certain conditions where the terrain following system needs to be reset, and you can do that with the paddle switch. That just leaves us to show the system off, viewers. There are 2 modes: manual, where the system guides you, but you do the flying, and auto. Auto couples itself with the autopilots in the aircraft. And I say autopilots because there are various types of autopilot. That way you can blend the terrain following autopilot with various other onboard autopilot types. And then finally, we'll look at some no-goes, some ways that you can abuse the system, some situations where you shouldn't maybe use terrain following. So first, manual. We are at the start of our steer point chain with steer point 1 selected. All we've got to do, assuming we've got everything set up as I showed earlier with the terrain radar on and our clearance set, is to fly so that our velocity vector is in or above this box here in terms of elevation. In terms of azimuth, we want to keep our velocity vector on or as close to the steering bar as we can, and that will sort our azimuth out. Our speed we have to control ourselves, and it wants to stay between 400 and 650. If it goes lower, you will get serious problems. And that's pretty much it. We'll force some warnings as we go if we don't get warnings as standard. Unpause. Right, I will need to turn the sounds on so you can hear the warnings. Right, just keep an eye on speed. I might as well zoom in there. And in fact, no, you'll probably want to see the whole thing, won't you? Let me get there. Distance to steer point on the bottom right of the HUD, and it's going to be pretty uneventful, so I can probably speed up. So all I'm doing is keeping the velocity vector on the steering bar. Whee, down it goes. And if I can, inside or slightly above the command pitch box. Why slightly above? Well, it's impossible to keep it in it all the time. You'd have to be super pilot. So if you're going to be out of it slightly, it's better to be above than below, obviously. Oh, another good point I forgot to say. If you're flying very low, I've got 500 feet here, which is relatively high. If you're going to go 200 or 100 feet, you're going to get this siren all the time going off, the low altitude warning. So turn it off by clicking that there. And unpause. Alright, this is nice and easy. Let's start forcing some problems. So I'm going to roll too much to one side. Let's see what happens. Pause. Turn rate is too high. I've got 2 seconds to correct that. If I don't, it'll take control and do a fly up. Turn rate again the other direction. And it's done a fly up. I didn't even... Yep, so I went outside of one of the limits too far, and it's now done a fly up. It's now taking control of my pitch, and it's pulling me up to safety. If you're doing a proper fly up, you'd probably want to take it all the way up to the MEA, 12,000 feet. But as this is just a demonstration, we won't bother. We'll just override it. So I'm going to unpause. I'm going to push and hold the paddle switch to disarm the system or override the fly-up. And unpause. You see it's unarmed now. I'm just going to get myself back in rough parameters. So Steering bar's over there somewhere. I'm just about to hit steer point 1. It's a bad time ready to get. There we go. Alright, I've unpressed the paddle switch and I'm back in action now and everything's good. Right, it's automatically gone to steer point 1 and it's now steer point 2. I can't see the symbology very well there, but it's there. Okay, we're back on track and you don't want to see the whole thing, so why don't we try and force a pull up through an obstacle. So I'm going to fly deliberately too close to this bit of mountain here. Watch the radar down on the bottom left. Watch what happens with the obstacle warning line. And you'll find it will again try and save me by pulling up and doing a fly up. Obstacle, fly up. I did not do that. I did not pull up at all. I should have shown my controls. It did it all for me. So it showed obstacle, it showed something else I've forgotten, and then it did a fly up, and it's now going to fly up all the way out of safety. I'm going to override that because I know I can. I'm going to get back down to the pitch. I'm going to unpress paddle now, and we're back in the system. And everything's good. We're back on the steering bar, and we're back on the pitch. And just keep going through your waypoint chain like that. Note, viewers, that you don't have to use the hardening. You should, obviously, but you could actually fly the whole thing from down here. You've got your velocity vector, you've got your pitch box, you've got your azimuth line, you've got your horizon, you've got your altitude, you've got your speed. So you could sit and do it like this. In fact, God forbid, let me try it. Probably a terrible, terrible idea. Too fast. Yeah, why not? Up. Up. Roll. So not advised, but I don't see why you couldn't fly it like that. Right, that shows manual mode, and you just need to have a good play with it. Feel where those limits are. Listen to the limits within a couple of seconds or whatever the time limit is. Whenever it flies up, then just cancel it and get back on and practice it. Right, viewers, let's reset and let's do automatic mode. This one's a bit more complex, but it is super cool. Right, off we go. So, ATF, automatic terrain following. Let's set our system up as quickly as we can from scratch. So, nav mode, on. Terrain following, left screen for me. HSI, right screen for me. Make sure terrain following radar is on. Radar out, on. Don't care about the rest. We will come back to this switch here, TF couple, which will couple us to the autopilot system. Right, so first we want to get into our basic ATF, autopilot terrain following. To do that first, I must make sure that we're flying in all the various parameters that we need to be in. So let's get speed up above 400. Let's get the velocity vector roughly on the horizon line. Let's get wings level. Let's get trimmed just about neutral, just to make the autopilot happy. We don't do all this stuff and cause some problems. Make sure we're not too low, and we're not. Right, now we are going to terrain following couple. Pause. That's now initiated this automatic terrain following. That's our base automatic mode. That means that it would automatically control our pitch to maintain our desired 500 feet clearance, but I retain control of the roll of the aircraft as well as the yaw, and I also obviously have control of the power and always will. Another way of checking that we're in automatic mode as well as seeing it here is to check that our manual pitch command box has disappeared. It's now just a line. So that's another way of showing that we're in ATF. We can just speed it up. So I can roll left, I can roll right, but the up and down is being done by the autopilot. I can still exceed my limit to roll, look, and I'll need to cancel them before I get myself in trouble. That's it. It'll just keep going like that, but just doing the pitch. Now, what if we want to blend that with other autopilot modes, of which there are numerous? Well, let's now blend it with a heading autopilot. To do that, I'm going to press autopilot down here, and that's put us through to our default blend, which is heading blended with terrain following. So now the terrain following part is controlling our elevation, and the azimuth is now being controlled by the heading. It's just basically going to keep us on this heading. Now, what if we wanted to do something a bit more ambitious? And we're not going to go through all the autopilot modes because there are lots, but what if we wanted to do the fully automated navigation mode where we can get the plane to fly not only terrain following, but also follow the waypoint chain? Well, that's super simple, obviously. You just click there, and it's now gone to a blended mode of nav and terrain following. You can cycle through the different modes, by the way, by pressing the autopilot button here. So it's now, theoretically, going to control our roll to get us to the steer point. Has it just got... No, it's working. And our elevation. I'm not touching anything right now, by the way. Oh, speed. That's something I do have to do. Power, 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 power. Okay, we're good. Just going to speed that up. Hey presto, look at that. It's taking us to steer point 1. Steer point 2 is going to take us right. And it's a pretty good system. We haven't really managed to fox it yet, unless we're asking too much of it. I'll take us on a whole waypoint chain until we get to the end, and I'm not actually sure what it does at that point. To cancel the autopilot, you can exceed any of the input limits that cancels the normal, non-terrain following autopilot, or you can just decouple here and turn my autopilot off, and we're back to a manual terrain following mode, and you can tell because you've got the manual pitch box there. Oh, and another way of cancelling it is using the paddle switch that we saw earlier. Finally, viewers, I'd like to show you a couple of scenarios, as promised, where maybe you shouldn't use the terrain following radar system. So first, I want to do a Top Gun style run through this canyon. You can see at very low altitude, fully automated by the system. It just won't be able to do this. It might just about to be able to achieve the azimuth, but to keep itself low like I want it, it's just not going to be able to do it. Anyway, let's go and prove it to you. Let me set the jet up as quickly as I can. I'm going to go to autopilot. I'm going to go to nav mode. I'm going to press that. Okay, I've got it on nav, blended with terrain following radar mode. Let's see what happens. So what I wanted to do... Oh, yeah, and my altitude. 300 feet. I wanted to fly 300 feet through this canyon, but look where it's actually going. It's actually doing a bit better than I thought. Why don't we try 200 feet? 200 feet. No, it's gone off now. Look, I wanted it down in that canyon along that line. And why? It's because it's putting it out of limits. 5 degrees per second and all that other stuff means that we can't do the harsh flying that's required to be inside that canyon. Let me show you another one in terms of putting in harsh kinks in the waypoint chain in terms of azimuth. So I want it to go there. Then I want it to go there. Then I want it to go there. Let's see what happens when we chain that up. So it's going to take the harsh right in 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile. Go. But it can't make the turn, look, because it's got 5.5 degrees a second. So it's just going to, well, it's going to go nuts, obviously. It just can't. I'm asking it to do the impossible.
Pull your map up on the right MFD. You'll be able to see how the airplane's not able to. So it's always going to be trying to go to waypoint 2, even if you overfly waypoint 3, it'll never swap over to waypoint 3.
And that's because I physically can't get to waypoint 2 with these limits, yeah?
Correct.
Right, so I went there, I got to there, it's now trying to turn right to waypoint 2, but it just can't do it, viewers. So it will now just spin around forever, locked in a loop. And that's not the plane's fault, it's because we're abusing the system. The only reason I'm showing you these exceptions, viewers, is because these are the things that we've learned the hard way that make you really annoyed. That's it guys. It's relatively simple, but I'll describe as hard to master, and I certainly haven't mastered it. Advice would be to learn the limits, and careful not to exceed the limits, and that will stop frustration. You guys have probably had a bit more time on it than me. What do you guys think? Anything to pass on to the viewers?
If you're going to plan a mission using the auto navigation system, just be aware. Be aware of the limits. Make sure your steer points aren't going to put you in a harsh parameter. Know that the airplane is limited on its ups and downs. It's like if you take the Caucasus Mountains and you're kind of running that east-west along the mountain chain, it's gonna go up and down, but you're never really gonna get down into the valleys because it's got to predict whether or not it can pull up over that next terrain within its time that it can see.
The other thing I would say is if you're flying in auto mode, you need to make sure that it's doing what you want it to do by checking your autopilot status.
This is a piece of equipment that's in the tens of millions, maybe 100 million, I'm not sure. So the limits are there to make sure that the people that make this don't lose it to harsh turns and stuff. So that's why it's got to have the limits.
I was just going to say, now do it, Cap, with zero visibility on.
Well, I did, didn't I? I showed you earlier on. I could do it just by flying that there. That's technically doing IFR. So it 100% does work. And that's kind of why it's there. You know, you'd fly VFR otherwise. All right, viewers, I hope you enjoyed that. And bye-bye.